So, welcome to Fixing Out. I'm your host, Sarah Elder. Today, joining me in the store, which is all too rare, unfortunately, is Taleeb Noormohamed. You're the MP for Vancouver Granville, a very beautiful part of the BC world. And you're the Parliamentary Secretary to Pascal St-Onge, the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
That would be me, yes.
That's you?
Here, yes.
Confirmed?
Confirmed.
The background check in terms of it's like calling the bank and having to identify yourself.
Exactly.
That's you?
Exactly. It's me. Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm really glad to see you. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, I know. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. We're going to be talking about the CBC, which is going to be a big topic during the coming months in multiple ways, probably.
Yep.
A federal Liberal leadership race and then a general election.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain politician who loves to talk about defunding the CBC. What that actually means is something else. But I wanted to start with a softball and ask you, or we can share our favorite childhood CBC shows, because I feel like that's a good way to ease into this conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
So tell me.
So for me, it's a bit of a tie between two. So I grew up watching The National and The Journal, starting at a very young age with my parents and my grandparents. I remember Knowlton Nash and his booming voice, and it has stuck in my brain. And then The Journal with Barbara Frum. And, that was, as I was a nerd as a kid, probably still a nerd. So for me, that was my earliest memories are of that and of Casey and Finnegan and Mr. Dress Up.
Oh.
So I will, on occasion, actually reference Mr. Dress Up. Particularly at Heritage Committee, when we're talking about the CBC, sometimes I will quote Mr. Dress Up.
Okay.
It's crazy. But I think they sit on at two different points on what made the CBC what it is, right? The ability for people to engage with, for kids to be able to engage and learn and grow and expand their minds and learn different things they didn't even know they were learning.
Yeah.
And then to have good news and actual conversation about the news and to get, down and dirty on things that we, sometimes are a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yours?
Road to Avonlea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
So we didn't have cable. I grew up in Chilliwack. I'm a child of the Fraser Valley, and we didn't have cable. So we only had like 2 or 3 TV channels, and the CBC was one of them. So Road to Avonlea was like I just grew up falling in love with that show. Growing up in BC and then having it take place in on the other side of the country, right? It just kind of captivates your imagination. Funny thing, the first trip my husband or then boyfriend and I ever took together, we went to PEI, and my husband is from Iran originally, didn't grow up with the CBC, obviously. Had never seen the show before. And we went to a place called Avonlea Village, which is have you been there?
So I spent a lot of years on the board of the Confederation Center, which every other year puts on cable. So not only do I know the story, I love it. And I've been there.
So, but my husband has an aversion to wearing other people's clothes. And he had no context for this place. So there was like a house where you could go and dress up like the characters. And there was like a wagon that you could get into. It was like, a backdrop for photos. So when I was like, here's your overalls, a plaid shirt, and this hat, and I'm going to put on this long, Anne of Green Gables wig, and we're going to dress up. And he thought I was insane.
But you're still together.
We're still together. And I can't wait to take our kids there.
There you go.
So
thanks to the CBC.
Exactly.
The other, it's funny you mentioned not having cable growing up. We didn't have cable until I think probably high school. And so it was, the Knowledge Network in BC and the CBC. And I think it was a really good thing because,
growing up without technology, with limited technology in itself is
also
a good
was
thing.
great.
Yes.
We managed to make it to places. We managed to meet our friends, and we didn't need to check our smartphones every 10 minutes.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
and we got places using maps.
Well, maybe that's why we are where we are now. Because I think that kind of culture of, resiliency, that, there's something to be said for that.
Sure.
But In terms so we've both valued or have deriven value from the CBC in different ways growing up with it. And even people who weren't born here, I think the CBC is an opportunity for them to understand more about what Canadian culture is. Yeah. What Canadian culture is, how it's defined is a big, I think actually hard for us, and it shouldn't be. So when you're having conversations about the value of the CBC and contributions to Canadian society, and people are like, well, and they pull out the Polyev talking point, like just defund it. What do you say to them?
Well, I first you have to interrogate a little bit and say, what exactly are you defunding?
Right.
Because, Polyev sometimes talks about defunding the CBC, but keeping Radio-Canada, which is insane because you actually share so many of the same resources, camera people, sometimes the reporters, the technical support, so on and so forth. So I think there's a bit of a naivete about saying, let's just get rid of the whole thing and everything will just manage accordingly. But the real question is, what are you defunding in the sort of strategic and esoteric sense a little bit too? And you're actually, if you look at the CBC is the number one source of news for Canadians. The CBC is the most used online news platform in the country. It has a network of reporters across the country that are delivering local news to Canadians. But it's also one of the, if not the largest supporter of the creation of new Canadian content. And the thing about being a public broadcaster is that it is not a for-profit entity. And because it's not a for-profit entity, you're able to do things that, that is not driven entirely by whether or not it's going to be profitable, right? Yeah. Whether that's profitable. But then you think about things like Kim's Convenience, you think about all of these different things that have come out of the CBC. And you ask yourself, would any of those shows had a chance in an environment where there was no CBC? And if not, would we just be importing a whole bunch more CSI from the US and putting that on our channels? Not that it's a bad thing to, but surely there is space in our conversation for a vibrant CBC that is transformative. Now, the CBC isn't perfect, but the opportunity, I think, that most of us view is that because it's not perfect, it's an opportunity to adapt to where we are today.
Yeah.
And when Polyev talks about the CBC, he's talking about television, he's talking about television broadcast numbers. Every single broadcaster on television, on cable, has seen a decline. That's the reality because of streaming services, because of all these other ways in which we consume content. And the CBC is actually doing pretty well on its digital platforms relative to others, quite well. And so I think we have to start having a very thoughtful conversation about what the CBC can be, how it can transform, how it can adapt to the reality of technology and also the reality of where Canadians are, and be a place where we can actually have informed, thoughtful debate and discussion about the issues of our day. And to me, there is a lot of space for that in a world in which we are so very polarized.
Is there space to have conversations on the CBC where it's not everyone agreeing with each other, though?
Totally. Yeah. And you should.
Yeah.
Right? Like there are folks that are really upset that the CBC didn't go full bore and bid for Hockey Night in Canada. There are folks that say we shouldn't be spending large dollars on sports. But, you have to have those conversations in terms of programming, in terms of the nature of what it is supposed to be. Should it only be X or Y? If you don't have those conversations, if you don't absorb those ideas and put them into the hopper, it's pretty hard to come out with something really good at the other end. I mean, nobody has a monopoly on good ideas, but I think you have to consider them and weigh them out and ask the question, what will that actually do for us in the long term in terms of being able to have a platform that connects with Canadians and lets Canadians be proud of what they're seeing and hearing.
Is that change possible?
I think it's essential.
Yeah.
Possible is not a question. You have to do it.
Okay.
And I think doing it is going to require a lot of hard work. I know with Minister St. Ange, you had her on here. I think you guys chatted a little bit about it. There's a lot of work that is being done that needs to be done. And it should always be a work in progress. Like I always talk about Canada as a work in progress, right? And that's the beauty of this country. And I think it's very much the story of the CBC as well. If you look at the CBC of the 1940s and the 1950s, that's not the CBC of today. And my hope is that our kids will look at the CBC 10, 15, 20 years from now and say, oh, look, it also adapted to where we are without losing a fundamental grounding in being a very proud voice of Canada and Canadians.
I agree. Yeah. People don't understand, I think, how that the CBC is a crown corporation and that it's not in the business of making money. And I think it can be hard when people also use the argument. I mean, even think about Canada Post as an example, right? It does lose money, but the value that it provides, but also I think what gets lost in the conversation is, for example, during the postal strike, Northern Canada was essentially cut off from mail delivery because for-profit companies won't go to those areas because it doesn't make money. So Canada Post serves, a part of the country that would be completely abandoned if we were just to leave it to the free market. And I think it's really easy for people in Vancouver and even here in Calgary, anywhere in Canada that's, considered quote unquote urban, right? What would if we were just to defund the CBC, what would happen to rural and remote areas in Canada who would just simply where would they get their news? Who would tell their stories? What would happen to them?
Well, I think nobody's going to tell their stories. I think that the reality is nobody is going to tell their stories. And people are going to hope that their video on TikTok or YouTube might make the big time. And that'll be it. In terms of news outlets having reporters in places like Lethbridge and Red Deer, forget about it. It's not going to happen, right? Because it's not nearly going to deliver the value that a reporter in another city might, Edmonton or Toronto or Vancouver. And so if you're in a for-profit enterprise, you're going to make decisions on the basis of where your listeners are going to be, your viewers are going to be, and where the density of your stories are going to be. But it speaks to the kind of country that you want. If you want a country that is predicated on the principle that me first, I'm going to worry about me, I'm going to worry about where I am right now, and I don't give a damn about anybody else in any other part of the country, particularly in rural or northern communities, then go that way. But if you actually care about building the fabric of a country where I get to hear the voice of someone in Hay River or the voice of someone in Gander, and that's important for me as a Canadian from British Columbia.
Yeah.
And it's equally important for someone in rural Kings Hants, Nova Scotia, to hear the voice of somebody from Vancouver and to see how they're thinking about something. There's no other platform that is going to make that time, effort, energy, investment to do that. And I think if you're talking about building a nation, building a country, you absolutely have to have ways to hear each other. And sometimes that's not going to make money. But what it is going to do is make a country. And I find it particularly rich that if you look at the members of parliament from rural Alberta, rural Saskatchewan, the conservative members of parliament who are attacking the CBC, it is their communities. It is those rural voices. It is the reporters sitting in Lethbridge. Those are the reporters and those are the stories that Canadians and the rest of the country aren't going to hear. Those of us who vote in so-called liberal ridings, who live in urban Canada, we might be okay, because, we get all kinds of different things and stuff, and people report on what's happening in Vancouver or downtown Toronto or Montreal or Calgary. But I want to know what's happening in Esterhazy, Saskatchewan. I want to know what's happening in the North because I care about this country and I care about the idea that we should actually understand each other because the stories that we talk about are going to matter. A good friend of mine is the member of parliament for Kings Hants, Cody Boyce. Cody is a rural guy. He is the son of a truck driver and executive assistant. He represents a rural riding. He's a white guy. He had, I don't think he'd ever been to Vancouver until he got elected. And he talks about things in his riding. Like they have, these suppers in church basements that are a big part of what happens in his community. And I brought him to Vancouver. We were doing something. And, for him, it was a completely different thing to see how things happen in Vancouver, Granville. But we have the benefit of jobs that allow us to see each other and hear each other. But now I'm really curious about what happens in his community. And it helps inform my decisions as a Canadian. And it helps inform my thinking of what my country is.
Yeah.
And I think every Canadian should have the ability to hear these voices from across the country in English, in French, in Indigenous languages, so that we can actually, we have this incredible blessing of this country. And the curse of the country is its geography, right? Because you can't drive, 2 hours and really get to a different province in many cases.
You can not get across from the North Shore to downtown Vancouver in 2 hours on a bad day.
Bad day, right? Yeah. For me, it takes sometimes 40 minutes to get through my riding.
Yeah.
If somebody in Nova Scotia, rural Nova Scotia, is driving 40 minutes,
you should try to cross Calgary.
I've missed many of the because of traffic on the Deerfoot. Yeah. Yes. But I think it's very simple. It's very simplistic. Simplistic to say, defund the CBC, right? Without asking the question, what impact are we having on communities? What impact are we having on Canadians? And what impact are we having on the fabric of the country? Now, it may serve the political interests of some people to say, look, let's just keep dividing each other so that we don't hear each other's voices and that we can live in our own echo chambers and our silos. But that's not good for the country. It's not good for the country to be in a space where we create voids intentionally such that Canadians do not have the ability to hear each other, learn from each other, and engage with one another.
Well, I mean, maybe that's actually, the ulterior motive, right? Because it actually benefits political objectives rather than benefiting, our society and in a more difficult way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I had a chance to listen to, I wanted to talk to you about, because I thought it was refreshing. And actually, I want to hear more of this on the CBC. Elamine Abdelmahmoud did a podcast with 3 very vocal, what would be described generally as conservative critics of the CBC. And he was, I love that he did it.
Yeah.
Do you think there's validity to the criticism that, that they have around content and advertising and, the stories that it tells? Do you?
I think absolutely you have to. So let me start by saying that debate was a really good one. And I think it opened up a lot of people's eyes to the fact that you can actually have a thoughtful conversation about national institutions without just tearing them down.
Yes.
Right? Like if you begin with the premise that it must disappear because it is bad, you have not had the conversation about does it have value and how do we make sure it delivers more value?
Yeah.
And what I found refreshing about that conversation is exactly that. It was not a conversation about let's just burn it down.
Well, I mean, to some extent, one more than others. Right. Yes.
I think in the 2 of the 3 plus Elamine, there was this the conversation is how do you improve an institution? And I think this is something that we have to adopt as a society. If something isn't working well, the answer is, can you improve it? Not let us, the first instinct be to burn it down and to destroy.
Yeah.
But something like the CBC has adapted in the past, and it's going to adapt into the future. And I think there are valid conversations to be had about the form and nature of the content on the CBC. There are valid conversations to be had about should there be advertising, should there not be advertising? If you don't have advertising, what are you shrinking? I mean, these are all...
Where does that money come from to make up for the shortfall?
Right. Are we prepared to put more money into public broadcast and have no advertising? These are all very real, very serious conversations that can and should be had. But it begins from the premise that you don't want to destroy the institution.
Right.
For most of us. And I think if you start by saying, look, we all believe, or the majority of us believe, and I think polling shows that, including among more than 50% of conservative voters, that there is value in maintaining the CBC, then we can open up a conversation, and we should open up a conversation that says, what's working? What's not? Look, I come from a business background. I'm a tech guy. You test and you learn. And the idea of always improving your product so that consumers will buy it is really important.
Yeah.
But you also, when you are when you are a crown corporation, you have an obligation to invest in longer term things that may not deliver value right away. How do you make sure you have capacity?
Well, being respectful of taxpayer money.
Absolutely. Without question. How do you deliver longer term value? Like, do we see where the trends are going, and do we invest into those trends today? It's very important, right? CBC made a big bet on digital, and it seemingly has done quite well.
Yeah.
Are there some things in the CBC that aren't for me? Totally.
Well, the same with anything, right?
Yeah.
That's the same way the store is, that, people will be like, well, it's not for everyone. Well, I don't love watching baseball. If I'm not going to go to maybe I'm not going to go to a sports bar and sit there and watch.
Exactly.
Right. It doesn't always have to be, but I might go there for something else.
Yeah. Like, we have very healthy debates in our home. Like, for me, I think there's a lot of, like Perry Mason, like 2.0, super. I like it. I don't really care for
the guy with do you know which one I mean?
Yes.
The train guy.
There's a new version. Okay. There's lots going on. But I whether it's that, whether it is, Real Housewives, which is definitely not something that I would spend 30 seconds watching, but there are people that love it.
It's so good.
This is a longer conversation, or hockey, or hockey or football. Yeah. People watch different things, and that's perfectly fine. Right? Well, like, that's totally cool. But, just because
you don't watch it doesn't mean it shouldn't exist.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Yes.
And just because I don't like something that a broadcaster, doesn't mean, say, take down the entire broadcaster. Like, this is the thing. Right?
I mean, that's ultimately cancel culture.
Correct.
Right.
The irony, right? The irony of
that it's ultimately cancel culture. I'm going to, defund it, destroy it, take it down because I don't like it. That is actually what cancel culture is.
Correct. I don't like its perspective, so it must go.
Exactly. Yeah. So, the irony is so thick and so rich.
Yeah.
I really want people to be challenged, and I hope that that's what the leadership race does federally in your party and in the general election is, for these questions to be asked, right? And hopefully for there to be an opportunity to be, more than a 5-second response, because I think it's worth more than a 5-second response.
Yeah.
People need fulsome answers in detailed ways. And my request to people who are listening to this, and I make this plea often, which is like, don't just let people come and ask for your vote and let them talk to you about why they should support you. Like, when we must, as voters, make you work for your jobs.
Totally. Absolutely.
And it shouldn't be easy.
No. And I think it's not easy, and it shouldn't.
Well, and right? It shouldn't.
I think there are, I think one of the challenges of when people say, oh, it's a safe liberal seat or a safe conservative seat, and you win by 20 points or something, it's much harder to be challenged. Sometimes tight elections, close races, actually, they force people to identify the things that matter, to have really tough conversations at the doors and with people.
Yeah.
And whether it's a leadership race or whether it's an election, I think Canadians sometimes have to make difficult choices between imperfect options. And my sort of perspective on this is that if you believe in public institutions, then you have to sort of behave a certain way. And that certain way is to say, there is value in improving things. And when you talk about the CBC, if you believe fundamentally that there is value in an institution that allows the voice of Canadians from coast to coast to coast to be heard by one another, then you have to do the work to talk in very difficult terms sometimes about how to make that institution survive into the next 50, 60 years, 100 years. But we have taken away space for serious discourse in our political culture because 100%. We litigate everything right now on clips on Twitter or whatever the hell it's called, X, or these TikTok videos. And that has become how we try to litigate thoughtful ideas. And you can't govern using slogans. You can't make policy using TikTok, particularly TikTok. And you certainly cannot engage people in thoughtful ideas in 20-second sound bites. You have to have longer form conversations with people. And we have to recreate a culture like we used to have in this country, where you can have thoughtful, long form discussion and debate about the things that we care deeply about.
From different positions.
Absolutely. Like some of the best conversations that I had with people, and I'm really dating myself, was they had done a thing right after the referendum, there had been something that was put together, I don't remember the exact name for it, where young people from across the country got together in Ottawa to talk about Canada. And we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the internet, right? This is like in 1992. We didn't really have the internet. 93, whenever that, right?
Elementary school.
So there you go. I was in
just early high school. Bit older.
Yeah, a little bit older. But we all got together and we were having really difficult discussions around things like sovereignty.
Yeah.
Things like, what did it mean to be
Canadian?
To what did it mean to be Canadian, but to have all of these other identities as part of that.
Yes.
And I think this idea that somehow, a Canadian is a Canadian is a very important idea. But how we define Canadianness for each of us may be slightly different. But to be able to communicate that difference and see that it falls under the rubric of a profound set of shared values and a common sense of purpose for this country is something that we must create space for.
I 100% agree. And I was thinking about, how do I approach this conversation? And that was one of the things I wanted. So when I was in high school, I went I spent almost a year in Germany as an exchange student when I was 15.
Okay.
And we all had this weekend of meeting, this orientation weekend about, not that they really told us about what it would be like to live in Germany, but we were all supposed to introduce ourselves, get into our country groups and share, about and so there was this group of, I think, myself, a woman from Kamloops, a guy from Quebec. I think there were 4 of us. Stanley was from Ontario. Oh, a guy from Alberta. So around 5 of us.
Let me remember their names.
And I'm still friends with all of them. And we were like, what are we gonna, meanwhile, Brazil, easy. Australia, easy. All these other countries, even the Lithuanians were we were like, what do we talk about? Maple syrup and beavers?
Right. But, you think about those countries, almost single language, almost single culture.
Yes.
Very homogenous.
Which is actually what I feel we need to empower Canadians to do, is to acknowledge and celebrate all the different aspects of Canadian culture and empower people to talk about, I'm not Indigenous myself. We have, this is the history of Canada. Absolutely. And this is what it is. And we are represented by, such, diversity, and that diversity is our strength. And that makes us tell such a unique story throughout the world.
It's become a cliche for people, right? Like this idea of diversity as strength. People have said, oh, it's a cliche and it doesn't actually exist. And all the problems that we have in this country is because of diversity, right? I think.
But we need to talk about diversity as a strength.
Correct.
And give people the license to talk about that diversity without from a place of shame.
Well, I have said for 2 things. One is that, unfortunately, Canadian values has now become something that people, sort of bandy about. It's guiding principle. We don't use values, use guiding principles.
We have to take back the Canadian flag and the Canadian identity from the trucker convoy.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think this idea that, we move from this idea of tolerance to pluralism, where we genuinely engage with each other. We're curious about one another. We don't have to agree all the time.
Yes.
We don't have to agree all the time.
Yeah.
But
I'd love to see a CBC show called We Don't Have to Agree.
Listen, we should. I think there's a form online. I believe you.
Yeah, I should go and submit that feedback.
But it is really important. It is really, to me, as a. If I look at my background, like my own personal story, like my parents came to this country dealing with very difficult circumstances in East Africa. From an Indian origin family, came to East Africa, came to Canada. I'm born here, grew up on the West Coast, went away to the US, went away to the UK, came back home. My identities are part of what this country is, just as somebody whose family is a 6th generation family from Ireland who lives in Ontario, just as that Ukrainian family that came several generations ago and lives on the prairie, and of course, Indigenous peoples who have been here since the beginning of existence.
Yeah.
That is something that very few other countries have in this world.
Yeah.
And this idea that you can be all of these pieces in that mosaic we used to always talk about as kids is actually probably the most powerful thing we have to, I don't want to call it global domination, but to be a remarkable power in the world. Because look, when you talk about trade, you can take a Canadian that speaks any language of any country in this world, and they can be part of a team that you can go and you can do a deal in any part of the world. That's economic strength. When you talk about cultural diversity, the fact that you can learn from each other and experience all of the world in this one country and be curious about things.
We'll go to any city in Canada and you can, the world is represented.
This is it. And I think,
and from the smallest towns, the hamlets, all the way to the biggest epicenters, right?
Absolutely. Now, I think one of the things that we have to think through, and this, I know we're well off topic from the CBC, but again,
I feel like it's all in the.
But I actually do think that this is where the CBC has a role to play.
Yeah.
Is that we have seen, for better or for ill, sort of this thing where we are trying to narrow our circles.
Right.
Whether you are an Indo-Canadian in, Surrey or Brampton, or, someone who lives in a predominantly white community on the prairie, or someone from, whatever your Chinese, whatever your background is, to say that we have, because of things that are happening in the world, we have to turn insular.
No. And we have to go the other way.
And I think we have to go the other way. There is strength in going the other way and seeing the other as somebody not only equal to us, but someone from whom we can learn something and with whom we can build something better.
100%.
Right? That is, again, if the CBC reflects stories that allow people to experience something different from what they understand. And we're talking about Kim's convenience a little bit at the beginning of this call, right? It's tongue-in-cheek understanding of a particular culture or particular community sort of challenges.
Yeah.
You expose people to things and questions that they wouldn't otherwise see.
Yeah.
And that makes them richer, and it makes us richer as a country. So for me, if we take one thing away from all of the fraught stuff that we're seeing in the world, fraught with challenges, fraught with sort of this idea that we have to pull inward, let's ask ourselves, what do we actually have available at our disposal to break that down and say, let's listen to each other, let's hear each other, let's do it in a way that is comfortable for each of us, so that we can build the economic strength and the social capital that this country has and should advantage from.
Yeah.
But we have to be willing to do that work. And the CBC, to my mind, is critical to being able to be a bit of a platform for that.
CBC is a part of Canada and Canada is a part of CBC.
Totally.
Okay, we're going to wrap things up, but I wanted to ask you, we'll share again. So we started with childhood. Let's go to present day. What is maybe something like that you're listening to or watching to on CBC?
I mean, I consume a lot of news on CBC. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of that.
Do you have a favorite anchor?
Do I have a favorite? I mean, I watch a lot of the Ida Shoe panels. So
okay.
I would say so I don't know that I have a favorite anchor anymore. I mean, this is not, to me, I don't have the same connection that I do with anyone now that I had with Knowlton when I was growing up, but that's definitely, that is circumstances. I mean, Ian Hannah-Mansing, I'm very biased towards.
Everyone has a crush on Ian
Hannah-Mansing. He is also my constituent.
Oh,
so
is
I'm
he?
particularly proud of him.
Yeah.
But he is, I think he's amazing.
He's amazing.
He is absolutely amazing.
But it's on my list to meet Rosemary Barton.
Oh yeah, Rosie.
Life goals.
Yeah, Rosie.
Yes.
Also excellent. Yeah. David Cochran is great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So they have so many amazing people.
Yeah, I mean, you can go through this entire list and say that these are all absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing journalists, amazing reporters. But in our house, every morning, the CBC is going on in the background on the radio. My partner is adamant that, from the moment we wake up in the morning, you are hearing the dulcet tones of the CBC in the background. And that's sort of the sound of waking up in the morning. That's the sound of the morning. And it's great because you were consuming things that you would not, intentionally or otherwise, but it's there. And it's in our home, it's a staple, right?
So CBC Radio.
CBC Radio.
Can I introduce
on the Sonos, streamed on the Sonos, right?
Okay. Can I introduce you to maybe what might be your new favorite show? It's called Mittens and Pants.
Okay.
It's about, you can get on CBC Gem. This is in no way sponsored. I wish. On my bucket list is also to meet these creatures. It's about a puppy named Pants and a cat named Mittens.
Okay.
They talk and they use and I think it's Mittens' parents are actually bunnies. Okay. So they use animals to talk about diversity of community.
Okay.
And about kinds of like resiliency and challenges and, storytelling using real animals, voiced by humans. Mittens and Pants.
All right.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And every time Elamine does anything, I'm watching.
Well, yeah. He's brilliant.
But different from Mittens and Pants.
Yeah. But my CBC is a place where I can, listen to Elamine.
Yeah.
Have that conversation with people who, don't agree with him, right? Watch the national, which I do almost every night. And after I put my kids to bed, and binge watch Guilty. I try to get my kids to watch Mittens and Pants because I actually want to watch it more than they do.
So let's say the CBC were gone. What would you do with all that time? Where would you get your content?
Well, I'd have to find it somewhere else, but that doesn't mean I want to. And I don't think we should have to.
I think that's to me, that's the answer. Like, you are now creating, you've opened up through this conversation, we've opened up a conversation about how do we improve the institution.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, if you ask most people, do you want the CBC gone?
Yeah.
Even if you're not watching Mittens and Pants or listening to Elamine or, you don't like Ian, I don't know who doesn't like Ian, but, I think most people would say, look, it's got to stay.
Yeah.
It's got to stay. We've got to make it better. And I think having that conversation is not just okay, but
necessary.
It's necessary, it's essential.
Yeah.
And if we don't have that conversation and if we don't dig into it, then the forces of the right who just want to destroy the thing and tear it down and defund it, they will win this argument. The country will be poorer for it. And in 10 or 20 years, we'll be asking why we did that.
Well, and so we'll wrap up the podcast and it'll go back to, when the general election starts and conservative and liberal and NDP candidates of every political stripe come to your door and you ask them, the most important issue to you, also ask them, what is your vision for the CBC?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really good.